were representatives of a people whose fate was being decided in the corridors of power. During that winter and into the spring, the Russian capital, St. Petersburg, witnessed the arrival of Jewish deputies from several provinces, Minsk, Podolaya, Mogilev, and Kiev. There is no record of deputies from other provinces, but those who did come were already enough to signal that a momentous event was taking place. The Jewish deputies were not only representatives of their communities, they were emissaries of hope, carrying with them the burdens and expectations of thousands of families. Their arrival coincided with a change in the political atmosphere that they could scarcely have hoped for. Dyrzhavin, the conservative architect of the harsh opinion on the Jews, had retired from the Jewish Committee after resigning his post as Minister of Justice. His views, rooted in the old Russian tradition, were ill-suited to the more liberal government that governed Russia in the early years of Alexander I's reign. With his departure, his opinion ceased to be an obligatory guide for the committee. The deputies breathed, perhaps, a small sigh of relief. Yet the deputies from the provinces found themselves in a city where Jews were only barely tolerated. St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, was not open to Jewish settlement. Jews were denied the right of permanent domicile, the right to live there permanently. Nevertheless, a small group of Jews, mostly from White Russia, lived temporarily in the city for business. They were allowed to die there and to bury their dead in their own cemetery. This cemetery, opened in 1802, symbolized the beginning of a Jewish community in the capital. It was a community born not in joy but in the need to claim a place even in death. In the summer of 1803, the provincial deputies met their metropolitan brethren at a strange and solemn celebration. At the suggestion of the deputies and in their presence, the remains of 3 Jews who had been buried in a Christian cemetery were transferred to the newly established Jewish cemetery. The act was not merely a burial, it was a declaration. It was an assertion that Jewish life, even when restricted and oppressed, could not be erased. The dead had to be given their own resting place, their own dignity. Among the Jews of St. Petersburg were men who, because of their connections with high officials and their familiarity with bureaucratic ways, could be of real service to the deputies. One of them was Notish Glover, who had recently taken the family name Notkin. He was a public-spirited merchant who, in 1800, had submitted his reform project to Dyrzhavin. He appears to have acted as an official advisor to the deputies, having been invited to participate in the work of the Jewish Committee. While on the committee, Notkin repeatedly insisted on his scheme of promoting agriculture and manufacturing among the Jews, a vision of transformation that aimed to free Jews from dependence on traditional economic roles. But he did not live to see his ideas triumph. He died shortly before the enactment of the law of 1804, in which his central theory found recognition. Another influential Jew in St. Petersburg was Abraham Peretz, a wealthy contractor and commercial counselor. He did not immediately involve himself in Jewish affairs, yet he too was useful to the deputies because of his business relations with the official world. In a city governed by bureaucracy, such connections were invaluable. Meanwhile, the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews, the official body tasked with reform, had reviewed the various proposals submitted to it. It worked out a general plan and communicated it to the Jewish deputies. But the deputies, after prolonged indecision, declared that they could not submit conclusions without consulting the Kahals that had elected them. They asked for a 6-month delay for consultation. The official Jewish committee, however, could not accept such a long postponement. It resolved to submit the principal clauses of the project to the Kahals through the government, with the understanding that the Kahals should not change the substance of the clauses but only suggest the best ways to implement the reforms. This epistolary inquiry failed to achieve its intended effect. The Kahals, restricted in their freedom of expression and forbidden to critique the substance of the project, limited themselves to requesting that the correctional measures be postponed for 20 years. They especially opposed the proposed prohibition of the sale of liquor and land tenure, because such prohibitions would undermine the economic foundation of Jewish life. The committee ignored this plea, which was in effect a condemnation of the basic principles of the project, and proceeded with its original course. Within the committee itself, unanimity was not achieved. 2 powerful tendencies struggled for dominance. One was utilitarianism, represented by the champions of correctional measures and the compulsory transformation of Jewish life. The other was humanitarianism, advocated by those who demanded unconditional emancipation. Among the latter group was Speransky, a brilliant and enlightened statesman. Had he lived in a different age, some believed, he might have succeeded in liberating the empire from the tyranny of the Tsars a century earlier. At this time, he served in the Ministry of the Interior under Prince Kochubey, a high official, and was engaged in devising reforms for the civil service. Speransky's presence added a new dimension to the debate, the possibility that the state might embrace the idea of freedom and equality not as a tool of control, but as a principle of justice. Thus the stage was set for a decisive conflict. On one side stood those who saw Jews as a problem to be corrected, to be molded into useful citizens through regulation and compulsion. On the other stood those who believed that justice demanded full emancipation, without conditions. The Jewish deputies, the St. Petersburg advisors, and the members of the committee were all caught in this struggle, as the empire itself stood on the edge of transformation, uncertain whether it would move toward liberty or retreat into old patterns of domination. Within the highest circles of the Russian government, amid ministries, councils, and committees crowded with ambition and suspicion, one man began to exert a quiet but remarkable influence. His name was Mikhail Mikhailovich Speransky, a statesman of uncommon intellect, born to modest origins yet risen by talent to the very center of imperial power. Speransky took a deep and active interest in the work of the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews, a special governmental body created to address what officials called the Jewish question. This committee was formally chaired by Prince Viktor Kochubey, a powerful minister and trusted advisor to the emperor, but in practice Speransky often acted in Kochubey's place. For a time, his voice carried the greatest weight within the committee's deliberations. There came a moment when his influence was unmistakable. On the 20th day of September in the year 1803, the committee met, and into its official minutes were written sentences unlike anything that had previously emerged from Russian bureaucracy. The language itself seemed to breathe a different air. The minutes declared that reforms imposed by the sheer power of the state were, as a rule, unstable, and especially doomed to failure when that power attempted to struggle against habits formed over centuries. Therefore, it was said to be wiser and safer to guide the Jews toward improvement not by force, but by opening before them the paths that led to their own happiness. The state, according to this vision, should observe their movement from a distance, remove obstacles that might divert them from progress, and refrain entirely from coercion. There should be no special agencies created for them, no attempts by the government to act in their place. Instead, the authorities were to limit themselves to clearing the road so that Jewish initiative could unfold on its own. The principle was expressed with striking clarity: as few restrictions as possible, as many liberties as possible. These, the minutes proclaimed, were the simple foundations of any sound social order. For the first time since the Russian government had begun to concern itself with the fate of the Jews, a genuinely rational and humane voice had spoken from within official ranks. This statement amounted to a direct condemnation of the prevailing system of state patronage and compulsory correction, through which officials believed they could reshape an entire people according to bureaucratic design. Here, at last, was articulated a principle rooted in humanitarian thought: grant the Jews unrestricted opportunities for development, allow their energies to operate freely, and in time they themselves would choose the path leading to progress and refinement. Yet even this moment of intellectual clarity proved fragile. The political climate of the Russian Empire, even during what many hoped was its season of reform under the young Emperor Alexander I, was harsh and unforgiving. Speransky's conception was too delicate, too advanced, to survive long in such an environment. Like a tender blossom exposed to bitter winds, it began to wither almost as soon as it appeared. Within the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews, the old and familiar doctrines soon reasserted themselves. The habitual political wisdom of the age, grounded in paternalism, supervision, and compulsory reform, returned to the forefront. When the committee submitted its formal report to Emperor Alexander I in October of the year 1804, scarcely a trace remained of the radical liberalism that had shone so briefly in the minutes of the previous year. The report opened with numbers, as imperial documents so often did. It sought to determine the size of the Jewish population within the empire. According to its calculations, there were 174,385 registered Jewish males subject to taxation. The report hastened to clarify that this figure represented less than 1/5 of the total Jewish population. By this reckoning, the committee estimated that nearly 1 million Jews lived under Russian rule. The document then turned to geography. This entire population, it explained, was concentrated almost exclusively in the western borderlands recently annexed from Poland and Lithuania, as well as in regions known as Little Russia, corresponding roughly to parts of present-day Ukraine, and Courland, a Baltic province along the eastern shore of the sea. The Jews, the report emphasized, were barred from settling in the interior governments of the empire. This was followed by a historical digression intended to demonstrate that Jews had never been permitted to settle freely within Russia proper, a claim designed to present exclusion as tradition rather than policy. The emperor was further informed that Jews were burdened with double taxation, paying more than other inhabitants. Although they were formally subject to the general courts and municipal authorities, and although their communal institutions, known as kahals, were placed under the supervision of the provincial police, the Jews nevertheless remained apart from the institutions of the state. They continued to manage their internal affairs through their own communal councils, maintaining a degree of autonomy that aroused suspicion among officials. Finally, the report addressed economic life. It singled out the sale of liquor, described as the most widespread Jewish occupation, and condemned it as a source of abuse that provoked constant complaints from the surrounding population. From these premises, carefully selected and arranged, the committee drew its conclusions. On this foundation it drafted a comprehensive law, which, with the approval of the emperor, soon took legal form. On the 9th day of December in the year 1804, there was issued the statute concerning the organization of the Jews. This new charter, which many would later call the Jewish Constitution of 1804, was a complex blend of concessions and restrictions. In its preamble, it declared that it was inspired by concern for the true welfare of the Jews themselves, as well as for the benefit of the native population of the governments in which Jews were permitted to reside. Even within this carefully balanced sentence lay a warning. The welfare of one group was explicitly tied to the interests of another, foreshadowing limits that would soon be drawn. The statute confirmed that Jewish residents would remain confined to a fixed territory, just as before. This area consisted of 13 governments of the empire. 2 were in Lithuania, 2 in White Russia, 2 in Little Russia, along with the governments of Minsk, Volhynia, Kiev, and Podolaya, and finally 3 governments in a region known as New Russia, the southern lands recently developed along the Black Sea. Beyond these borders, Jews were still forbidden to settle. Only one slight expansion was allowed, and even this was conditional. A future class of Jewish agricultural settlers, envisioned by the statute itself, was granted permission to establish colonies in 2 additional interior governments, Astrakhan, near the Caspian Sea, and Caucasia, the vast and turbulent region along the empire's southern frontier. Economically, the statute was built around 2 opposing principles, pulling Jewish life in sharply different directions. On the negative side stood rural occupations such as innkeeping and the leasing of land, which the law aimed to eradicate with uncompromising severity. On the positive side stood agriculture, which the government pledged to encourage and support among Jews by every possible means. The intention was nothing less than to uproot traditional patterns of livelihood and replace them with a state-approved model. The harshest expression of this intent appeared in Clause 34 of the statute, the most severe provision in the entire act. This clause was directed not only against the keeping of inns, but against rural Jewish occupations as a whole. It declared as follows. On the 1st day of January in the year 1807, a decree came into force that would strike at the very heart of Jewish life in the vast territories of the Russian Empire. In the governments of Astrakhan, a sprawling region near the delta of the Volga River, and Caucasia, the rugged mountainous lands between the Black Sea and the Caspian, as well as in the governments of Little Russia, roughly corresponding to the central and eastern territories of modern Ukraine, and New Russia, the southern lands recently annexed from the Ottoman Empire, the Jewish population was forbidden from holding leases on land, from operating taverns, saloons, or inns under their own names, or even under assumed ones, and from selling wine in any of these establishments. No Jew was permitted to reside in such places under any pretext, except as a transient traveler passing through. By the 1st day of January in the year 1808, this rule extended to all remaining governments of the empire. With one stroke of the imperial pen, an entire way of life, modest though it might have been, was eradicated. For centuries, Jewish families had eked out their survival through trades in taverns and small inns, through the brewing and sale of spirits, through leasehold agriculture in villages and hamlets. These were not merely jobs, they were the economic backbone sustaining almost one-half of the entire Jewish population within the empire. And yet, the Pale of Settlement, the limited territory assigned to Jewish residents, itself narrow and cramped, was further constricted, villages and hamlets being explicitly removed from the areas in which Jews might dwell or work. The architects of the law presented a supposed remedy, the opportunity for Jews to take up agriculture, to become tillers of the soil. They could purchase unoccupied lands in all Western governments, and even in 2 Eastern ones, or settle on crown lands, which belonged to the imperial treasury. Those settling on crown lands were assigned specific plots and, for the first years, were excused from paying state taxes. But the illusion of relief was quickly exposed. Hundreds of thousands of Jews, deprived of their ancestral trades, were offered an occupation for which they had no experience or tradition. Agriculture, at least for the first decades, could attract only small, isolated groups, insufficient to replace the livelihoods that had been swept away in a single, brutal stroke. Beneath agriculture in the hierarchy of sanctioned occupations were industry and handicrafts. Jewish manufacturers and artisans were exempted from the double taxation imposed on the community, and those who founded factories deemed most necessary were promised government loans. Merchants and burghers, however, were relegated to the last rank, tolerated rather than welcomed. All these permitted trades were subject to severe restrictions. Jews could travel temporarily for business into the interior of the empire, including the capitals of St. Petersburg and Moscow, but only with gubernatorial passports, the same type of document required for foreign travel. The statute went further, reshaping Jewish civil and communal life with a precision that was as rigid as it was intrusive. Under the chapter entitled On the Civil Organization of the Jews, every Jewish individual became subject to municipal authorities, ordinary police, and common law courts. At the same time, the law allowed the community to elect rabbis and kahal members, the governing council of the Jewish commune, who would serve for a term of 3 years and whose appointment required ratification by the gubernatorial administration. Rabbis were entrusted with the supervision of religious ceremonies and the adjudication of disputes involving faith, but they were forbidden to issue anathemas or excommunications, known in Hebrew as herem, a powerful traditional sanction. The kahals were responsible for the collection and timely payment of taxes. In essence, Jewish communal autonomy was engineered to serve 2 masters, religion and the state treasury, God and Mammon, with the expectation that the community would balance these conflicting obligations with strict obedience. Even more dramatically, the law sought to shape the minds and culture of the Jewish population under the banner of enlightenment. In the first chapter, bearing this very title, Jewish children were granted access to all public schools, gymnasiums, and universities within the empire. Jews were allowed to establish their own schools for secular instruction, but a single language, Russian, Polish, or German, was mandated for study. Within 2 to 6 years, this chosen language was to dominate public documents, promissory notes, and commercial ledgers. Members of municipal councils, rabbis, and kahal members were expected, by a defined period between 1808 and 1812, to speak and write fluently in one of these languages. Even their attire was regulated. They were to wear the clothing of Polish, Russian, or German fashion, erasing the distinctive dress that had long marked them as a separate people. This ambitious program, clothed in the rhetoric of enlightenment, reflected the Russian government's desire to appear modern and progressive, to echo the reforms of Prussian absolutism rather than the emancipatory ideals emerging from revolutionary France. In practice, however, it was a violent dismantling of centuries of social, economic, and cultural structures. The law tore apart the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands, replaced the rhythms of traditional life with coercive controls, and subjected the Jewish population to relentless oversight and hardship. The promise of reform masked a brutal reality: lives disrupted, communities unsettled, and the enforced imposition of a foreign pattern of existence on a people who had survived, thrived, and preserved their identity through centuries of exile and persecution. In the year 1804, the Russian Empire enacted a law that would cast a long and dark shadow over the lives of its Jewish subjects. This legal decree, as it became known, promised, in theory, certain benefits in the distant future. Yet for the Jewish communities of the empire, these so-called benefits were weighed against immediate and devastating hardships. For generations, these communities had nurtured a rich cultural life, rooted in their language, their schools, and their communal institutions. The very foundations of this life were threatened, and the prospect of their weakening offered little allure to a population largely untouched by the liberalizing currents of Western Europe. What the Jews felt most acutely, with a deep and sickening dread, was the imminence of economic catastrophe. The law called for the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Jews from the villages where they had lived for generations. Estimates soon revealed the terrifying scale: some 60,000 Jewish families, amounting to nearly 500,000 souls, were to be uprooted. The timetable was merciless. Within the 2 or 3 years before the enforcement of the expulsion, there was no realistic hope that such an immense population could find new fields of labor or establish new homes. Starvation loomed, a specter over every village and provincial town. Petitions poured into the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. They came not only from the Jewish councils, known as kahals, which had governed communal affairs for centuries, but also from country squires, the landed nobility whose estates relied on Jewish tenants and innkeepers for economic sustenance. The removal of these families threatened to devastate local economies, reduce revenues, and leave entire regions in turmoil. As the year 1808 approached, the deadline for expulsion, the cries of despair grew louder, echoing from the remote provinces to the palaces of the capital. Yet it is uncertain whether the Russian government would have heeded these appeals, had not an event occurred that sent shockwaves through the political circles of St. Petersburg. It was the autumn of the year 1806. In Paris, the so-called Jewish Parliament convened under the auspices of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French. This assembly, extraordinary in its ambition, announced plans for a universal convocation of Jewish leaders across Europe, a great synhedrion designed to unify and mobilize Jewish communities. Across the continent, monarchs and ministers observed this development with suspicion and alarm. The Austrian government went so far as to forbid their Jewish subjects from establishing any contact with the French capital, fearing that influence from Paris might spark unrest. St. Petersburg, too, grew uneasy. Napoleon, fresh from his crushing victories over the Kingdom of Prussia, was already moving through the Polish provinces, approaching the borders of the Russian Empire. His brilliance as a strategist and statesman was widely acknowledged, and the Russian authorities suspected that this convocation of Jews in Paris was not a mere cultural experiment. They feared it was a political instrument, a subtle scheme to win the loyalty of the Jewish populations in Prussia, Austria, and Russia to the French cause. The looming expulsion of the Jews from the villages could inflame resentment, providing fertile ground for Napoleon's agitation, and potentially turning the western provinces of Russia into a hotbed of anti-imperial sentiment in the very regions soon to become theaters of war. In this tense atmosphere, the Russian government reconsidered its plans. In early February of the year 1807, precisely as the sessions of the Synhedrion were opening in Paris, Prince Alexander Dmitrievich Kochubey, Minister of the Interior, submitted a report to Tsar Alexander I. Kochubey emphasized the necessity of postponing the forced removal of the Jews from their village homes, citing both the military circumstances on the western frontier and the inevitable economic ruin that awaited the Jewish population if the expulsion were enforced. The Tsar agreed. In response, a special committee was formed to examine the practical application of the Statute of 1804. Alongside Prince Kochubey and other high-ranking officials, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Count Andreas Ludwig von Budberg, was included, reflecting the diplomatic dimensions of the matter. On the 15th day of February, the Emperor directed Senator Alexeyev to inspect the western provinces, to assess the feasibility of the expulsion in light of both military and economic considerations. His instructions were clear: determine whether the enforcement of the law would be impossible or severely detrimental under the present circumstances. At the same time, the Minister of the Interior issued circulars to the administrators of the western provinces, commanding them to prevent any contact between the Jews of Russia and the Synhedrion in Paris. The French Assembly, it was suggested, was a dangerous instrument, seeking to curry political favor with the Jews and perhaps turn them against the Russian state. The circular went further, proposing a curious psychological tactic: the Jewish population was to be led to believe that the Synhedrion in Paris sought to alter the core of their religious beliefs. By casting the Parisian Assembly as a threat to the sanctity of Judaism itself, the authorities hoped to diminish any sympathy or enthusiasm for the French initiative, thereby ensuring that Russian Jews remained politically and socially aligned with the empire rather than with the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. Thus, the looming catastrophe of mass expulsion from the villages was temporarily arrested, not by compassion, but by the urgent currents of European politics and the subtle fear of rebellion in strategically vital provinces. The lives of hundreds of thousands hung in the balance, their futures shaped by decrees, suspicions, and the machinations of statesmen far removed from the realities of the villages where families tilled the soil and maintained their centuries-old traditions. The years of Napoleon's war cast a long shadow over the Russian Empire, and the shadow fell especially heavily on the Jewish communities. As the thunder of battle rolled across Europe, the Russian government sought to control not only armies and territories, but also hearts and minds. In this tense atmosphere, the Holy Synod, the supreme governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, issued circulars. They instructed the Greek Orthodox clergy to inform the Russian people that Napoleon was not merely a political enemy, but a spiritual enemy, a threat to the Church itself, and that he was a friend of the Jews. The Holy Synod's proclamation was not written in the measured language of diplomacy. It was a deliberate act of fear. It accused Napoleon of gathering the Judean synagogues of France and assembling them into a great Synhedrion, a council of Jewish leaders. The Synhedrion, the Holy Synod declared, was the same ungodly assembly that had once dared to pronounce the sentence of crucifixion upon Jesus Christ. Now, it was alleged, Napoleon intended to unite the Jews scattered across the world, inciting them to overthrow the Christian Church and to proclaim Napoleon as a false Messiah. The government, facing a war it could not control, used this fearful narrative to achieve a double purpose. It aimed to frighten the Jewish population by portraying the Synhedrion as a threat to their religion. At the same time, it aimed to frighten the Orthodox Russian populace by suggesting that Napoleon's supposed friendship with the Jews was a conspiracy against Christianity. In this precarious and dangerous situation, the government once again decided to seek the views of Jewish community representatives. A new circular inquiry was issued, asking for the best ways to carry out the reform of Jewish life. On February 19, the Tsar issued an ukase, a formal imperial decree, written in unusually mild terms. The Tsar declared that, prompted by a desire to demonstrate concern for their welfare, Jewish communes in several provinces, Vilna, Grodno, Kiev, Minsk, Podolaya, Volhynia, Vitebsk, and Mogilev, were allowed to elect deputies. These deputies, the ukase stated, could suggest to the provincial governors the means that they believed best suited for the successful execution of the measures laid down in the Statute of 1804. This time the deputies were not summoned to St. Petersburg. They were summoned to the provincial capitals to present their opinions directly to the governors. They were officially styled as attorneys of the Jewish communes, a phrase that sounded legal and impersonal, yet carried the weight of an entire people's fate. The deputies' responses went far beyond the single clause that all of them wanted repealed or postponed, the 34th clause, the most oppressive part of the statute. They raised serious objections to other provisions of the Jewish constitution. They demanded the abolition of double taxation for all classes of the Jewish population. They called for a wider authority for rabbinical tribunals, the Jewish courts that handled religious and civil matters among Jews. They also sought a relaxation of the rules forbidding the use of Hebrew in legal documents, promissory notes, and commercial ledgers. Some deputies argued that the restriction on Hebrew was harmful to business. Others suggested a compromise, allowing Hebrew for promissory notes up to the sum of 100 rubles. They also highlighted the difficulty rabbis and Jewish members of municipal councils faced in learning Russian within such a short time. They agreed to the change of dress for magistrates and for Jews living temporarily outside the Pale of Settlement, but they noted that the prescribed German dress was unsuitable for Jews who, for religious reasons, refused to shave their beards. They proposed that magistrates and visitors to the Russian interior should adopt the Russian form of dress instead. On the question of education, the deputies argued that it would be pointless for Jewish children to attend common Russian schools if they did not understand the Russian language. It would be more practical, they said, for the children to learn Russian first in Jewish schools, where they were already being taught Hebrew and the doctrines of their faith. By the time the governors had transmitted these opinions to St. Petersburg, the political climate had shifted dramatically. In July of 1807, the Peace of Tilsit had been concluded. A diplomatic agreement, an entente cordiale, had been established between Napoleon and Alexander I. Russia was no longer afraid of Bonaparte's intrigues. There was no longer any reason to fear a secret alliance between Russian Jews and the Parisian Synhedrion, which had recently been suspended. The bureaucratic compassion for the Jews vanished like mist. The final date set for the expulsion of Jews from the villages, January 1, 1808, was approaching. 2 months before that date, on October 19, 1807, the Tsar issued an ukase marked by extraordinary severity. He addressed it to the Governor-General of the Western region. The ukase stated that the war had complicated and delayed the transplantation of the Jews. Now that the war was over, these complications could be avoided by means of a gradual and orderly arrangement of the expulsion. The arrangement, however, was anything but humane. The expulsion was to be spread over 3 years. 1/3 of the Jews were to be expelled in 1808, another third in 1809, and the final third in 1810. Committees were appointed to assist the governors in carrying out the decree. These committees were instructed to make it incumbent upon the kahals, the Jewish communal councils, to provide financial assistance to those being expelled, those who were being pitilessly ruined by the government. The stage was now set for a brutal transformation. The Jews were to be uprooted from their homes, their livelihoods destroyed, their families thrown into chaos. And the state, which demanded obedience, required that the Jewish community itself pay for the suffering inflicted upon it. Then the terror ceased to be theoretical. It became physical, immediate, and brutal. The horrors of expulsion began. In village after village, Jewish families were ordered to leave the places where they had lived for generations. Some went willingly, clinging to the hope that obedience might soften the blow. Many others could not move on their own, because they had nowhere to go, no carts, no animals, no money, no shelter waiting beyond the village boundary. Those people were driven out by force. Peasants were summoned to act as escorts, soldiers were dispatched to enforce the decree, and under their watch whole families were torn from their homes. They were herded along roads like livestock, pushed toward nearby townlets and cities, and abandoned there on public squares, exposed to cold, hunger, and humiliation, without roofs, without food, without any means of survival. Nowhere was the expulsion carried out with greater savagery than in the government of Vitebsk, a western province of the Russian Empire with a large Jewish rural population. There, the removals were executed with exceptional ferocity. Eyewitness accounts spoke of beatings, of families dragged out in the depths of winter, of children and elderly people collapsing along the roads. The law had become a weapon, and mercy was nowhere to be found. Desperate for escape from this misery, many of the expelled Jews turned their hopes southward. They petitioned the authorities in large numbers, begging to be transferred to New Russia, the recently colonized southern territories along the Black Sea, where the government had established agricultural colonies. In these settlements, several hundred Jewish families had managed to find a fragile form of shelter and subsistence. To the exiles, these colonies appeared as the last possible refuge. But the petitions fell on empty hands. The available arable land had already been distributed, and the funds allocated by the treasury for resettlement were exhausted. There was nothing left to give. The appeals were ignored, not out of cruelty alone, but because the machinery of the state had reached the limits of its resources. The catastrophe grew so vast that even provincial governors, men accustomed to enforcing harsh policies, began to sound the alarm. In their reports to the central government in St. Petersburg, they admitted openly that it was impossible to carry out the expulsion decree without bringing about the complete ruin of the Jewish population. The destruction was too total, the suffering too visible to deny. Faced with this reality, the imperial government retreated. In the final days of December in the year 1808, a new imperial decree was issued. It ordered that Jews were to be left in their former places of residence until further instructions arrived directly from the emperor. The expulsions were halted, not because they had been judged unjust, but because they had proven unworkable. Barely a few days later, at the beginning of January in the year 1809, the government took yet another step. A new committee was formed in St. Petersburg, the third such body created to wrestle with the Jewish question. Its mandate was specific, to examine all aspects of the attempt to divert Jews away from rural liquor trading and into other forms of labor. This committee was composed of senior officials. Among them was Senator Alexeyev, a high-ranking member of the Imperial Senate who had personally toured the western provinces and witnessed conditions there. Alongside him sat Privy Councillor Popov, an experienced administrator appointed chairman of the committee, and Kozadov Lev, assistant minister of the Interior, representing one of the most powerful ministries of the empire. Others joined them, forming a body meant to combine first-hand observation with bureaucratic authority. In his written instructions to Popov, Emperor Alexander I made a striking admission. He acknowledged that the attempt to remove Jews from the villages had failed for a simple and unavoidable reason. The Jews themselves, he wrote, were so impoverished that they lacked the means to establish new homes after leaving their existing dwellings. At the same time, the government was equally incapable of relocating them all and providing them with new settlements. The state had neither the money nor the infrastructure required for such an undertaking. Therefore, the emperor concluded, it had become necessary to seek other ways. If Jews were to be removed from their exclusive involvement in selling wine in villages, hamlets, inns, and public houses, then they had to be given realistic opportunities to earn their living through other forms of labor. The committee was also instructed to take into account the opinions previously submitted by Jewish deputies, voices that had so often been ignored or suppressed. Only after years of harsh experimentation, after policies had been tested directly on human lives, did the government begin to understand a fundamental truth. Decrees written on paper could not reshape an economic order that centuries of development had created. Violence and restriction could destroy livelihoods and reduce people to destitution, but they could not bring about genuine improvement or moral transformation. The committee labored for 3 long years. Its discussions unfolded against a backdrop of war, financial strain, and growing uncertainty in Europe. Finally, in March of the year 1812, it submitted its report to Emperor Alexander I. Since the bold declaration voiced by Mikhail Speransky in the year 1803, this document was the first official statement to confront the Jewish problem with honesty rather than illusion. The report began by addressing the central premise of previous policies. It acknowledged that the government sought to remove Jews from the rural liquor trade because this trade was considered harmful to the population. But then it struck at the heart of the matter. The true source of drunkenness, the report argued, did not lie with the tavern keepers. It lay in the right of distillation itself, known as propination, a privilege reserved for the landed nobility and one of their principal sources of income. The report invited the emperor to imagine the consequences of expelling 60,000 Jewish tavern keepers from the countryside. Their places, it predicted, would be taken not by sobriety or reform, but by 60,000 Russian peasants. Tens of thousands of capable agricultural laborers would be lost to the fields. Meanwhile, the Jews could not be transformed overnight into competent farmers, especially when the government lacked the resources to finance such a sudden and massive change. Turning tavern keepers into grain growers was not a matter of will, but of time, training, and capital, all of which were absent. The report went further, challenging a deeply rooted accusation. It denied that the village Jew enriched himself at the expense of the peasant. On the contrary, it stated, the rural Jew was generally poor, surviving on meager profits from selling liquor and from supplying peasants with basic goods. By purchasing grain directly in the village, the Jew spared the peasant long journeys to distant towns, saving both time and labor. In the rural economy, the Jew functioned as an intermediary, a necessary link between landowner and peasant, between production and exchange. Remove him, the report warned, and the system itself would falter. The committee also dismissed the idea of transferring all village Jews to the cities and transforming them into manufacturers, merchants, or artisans. Even the Jewish population already living in cities struggled to survive. Artificially creating factories and mills, the report declared, would be equivalent to throwing money into water, especially since the imperial treasury possessed no surplus millions with which to subsidize such enterprises. The recent experiments of the government, the report concluded, had not improved Jewish life. On the contrary, the Jewish people had not only remained in poverty but had sunk into even greater destitution as a direct result of being forced out of occupations that had sustained them for centuries. Recognizing the condition of an entire people, and fearing that continued compulsory measures, especially under the present political circumstances, might provoke desperation and unrest among a population already restricted to the extreme, the committee declared it necessary to bring a decisive end to the prevailing methods of interference. Jews were to be allowed to remain in their former places of residence, and the occupations suspended by Clause 34 of the statute were to be restored. The imperial government, faced with mounting pressure, finally yielded. It was not the brilliant, searing arguments of the committee, whose report had methodically excoriated the existing system of state patronage, that forced the hand of the authorities. Rather, it was the political circumstances, ominously hinted at in the final passages of the report, that dictated action. Napoleon Bonaparte's Grand Army was advancing inexorably toward the Russian frontier. The war, one that would soon embroil the entirety of the Russian Empire and eventually sweep across all of Europe, had begun in earnest. In such a moment of existential peril, when French troops poured into Western Russia like a relentless tide, it was far more dangerous to leave behind groups of persecuted, embittered outcasts than it had been in the year 1807, when the threat of French invasion had been distant and theoretical. In the urgency of this crisis, the question of whether Jews should remain in the villages and hamlets of the empire resolved itself without the need for any special ukase, any formal imperial edict. Russia, stirred to its core, found that its salvation demanded the cooperation and strenuous exertions of all her inhabitants, Jews included. The role of the Jewish population during the War of 1812, often dismissed or minimized by historians, was in fact of no small significance. At the time, Jews were not yet conscripted into the Imperial Russian army, yet their influence extended in subtler, yet decisive, ways. The theater of the war lay largely in Western Russia, particularly in the northwest, where Jewish communities were compact and tightly interwoven into the fabric of cities, townlets, and villages. Their sympathy, whether leaning toward the French or the Russians, could sway the fortunes of detachments stationed in the area. It is well known that the Polish inhabitants of these western regions, long deprived of their kingdom, rallied overwhelmingly to Napoleon Bonaparte, hoping that his victory would restore the Polish state and deliver their dreams of national resurrection. The Russian Jews, however, approached the belligerent powers with a more nuanced and cautious eye. On one hand, the persecutions inflicted upon Jews in rural areas could have incited bitter resentment against the imperial government. Had these measures continued unchecked, the French, advancing as conquerors and reformers, might have been hailed as liberators by oppressed Jewish communities. Yet, these expulsions had ceased 3 years prior, and the Jews had reason to anticipate the eventual repeal of the cruel statutes, those laws so mercilessly condemned in the official committee report presented to Emperor Alexander I, in the early months of 1812. Deputies of the Kahals, summoned to participate in governmental work in both the years 1803 and 1807, had witnessed firsthand that the administration of Alexander I was, on the whole, favorably disposed toward the Jewish population. The mistakes and harshness they had suffered were less the result of malice than of the flawed system of state patronage, a system that sought, in its own heavy-handed way, to correct and improve Jewish life. On the other hand, the aura of Napoleon Bonaparte as a reformer had begun to fade, even in the eyes of Jews in Western Europe. The results of his so-called Jewish parliaments, assemblies intended to regulate Jewish communal life under French oversight, had revealed the limitations and dangers of his reforms. The Orthodox Jews of Russia, devout in their observance and careful to guard the integrity of their traditions, viewed the replacement of the autonomous Kahal system with a centralized consistorial organization as a direct threat to the continuity of Judaism itself. The conservative Hasidic faction, fiercely protective of religious and communal boundaries, felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Emperor Alexander I, whose statute of 1804 had specifically guaranteed Hasidim the right to worship separately in distinct synagogues within their communities. Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the eminent leader of the White Russian Hasidim, who had first faced suspicion from the imperial authorities but was later declared politically dependable, articulated the cautious wisdom of the Jewish elite. Should Bonaparte win, the wealth of the Jews will be increased, and their civic position will be elevated. At the same time, however, their hearts will drift from our Heavenly Father. Should Emperor Alexander prevail, the hearts of the Jewish people will turn closer to our Heavenly Father, though the poverty of Israel may deepen and their civic standing diminish. In other words, for these communities, religious integrity outweighed civic rights. The guarantee of spiritual and communal continuity, even at the cost of economic disadvantage and limited political status, was deemed more vital than the allure of legal equality under a foreign conqueror. These layers of political calculation, spiritual loyalty, and historical memory coalesced when the French invasion struck. The Jews of the Northwest demonstrated their allegiance to the Russian Empire, offering not mere symbolic support, but tangible assistance to the army. They provided services in logistics, supplies, and reconnaissance, often in regions where the local Polish population sympathized with Napoleon and worked against Russian forces. The famed Russian partisan, Denis Vasilyevich Davidov, would later remark on the hostility of the Polish residents of the city of Grodno, noting that their reluctance to cooperate placed Russian troops at great risk. By contrast, the Jews living in the same area, sharing the same towns and hamlets, refused to act as scouts for the enemy and frequently supplied the imperial army with critical intelligence, revealing the movements and positions of advancing French units. In these acts, whether in loyalty, cunning, or courage, the Jewish communities of Western Russia played a subtle, yet indispensable, role in the defense of the empire. As the storm of war and political upheaval swept across Eastern Europe, the Russian government found itself facing a peculiar dilemma in the western provinces, lands that had once belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish officials, whose loyalty was questionable and whose sympathies often leaned toward the forces of Napoleon Bonaparte and the French Empire, could not be relied upon to maintain order. The imperial authorities, therefore, took the extraordinary step of entrusting the entire police apparatus of the government of Grodno to the Jewish Kahal, the local council responsible for the administration of Jewish communal life. This decision was unprecedented. It placed in the hands of the Jewish population, through their elected representatives, a level of authority normally reserved for state officials. The governor of Vilna, the chief Russian administrator in that important province, reported with approval that the Jewish people had shown particular devotion to the Russian government during the presence of the enemy. Their loyalty was evident in countless acts of courage and self-sacrifice. The Poles, incensed by this pro-Russian stance, were rumored to have prepared massacres of both Jews and Russians in the governments of Vilna and Minsk and in the province of Bialystok. Yet the Jewish communities acted with remarkable courage. More than once, Jews who had hidden Russian couriers carrying vital dispatches, who had escorted them to the Russian headquarters, or who had supplied the Russian commanders with intelligence on enemy troop movements, were captured by French forces or by Polish partisans aligned with Napoleon and executed, either shot or hanged. Emperor Alexander I, himself keenly aware of these deeds of loyalty and bravery, took note. During a visit to the city of Kalisz, he granted an audience to members of the Kahal, engaging in long conversations with them about the welfare of their communities. Throughout the district, appeals written in Yiddish and other Jewish vernaculars circulated, urging the people to pray for the success of the Tsar, who, it was hoped, would liberate them from oppression and secure their future. In this period, as the waves of patriotism swept across the Russian Empire in response to the threat of Napoleon's advance, even the Jewish masses were caught up in the tide, participating in acts of civic loyalty and national devotion. During the years 1812 and 1813, as the Russian army marched westward to confront the French emperor, the headquarters maintained a close connection with Jewish representatives. Two such deputies, Sundel Sonnenberg from the government of Grodno and Lieser, also called Eliezer, Dillon from the city of Neswitz, served in a dual role. On one hand, they maintained contact with the highest officials of the Russian government, conveying the needs, wishes, and concerns of Jewish communities across the western provinces. On the other hand, they kept the local kahals informed about the intentions of the imperial authorities. These men were also large purveyors, managing the delivery of provisions and orders from the Russian army commissariat to their local agents. In this turbulent era, the government valued their presence at headquarters, for they could influence the loyalties of the Jewish population, aligning it with the political strategy of the Russian state. In June of the year 1814, while Emperor Alexander was abroad in Bruxelles, a town in the Grand Duchy of Baden in Germany, he instructed these deputies to assure the Jewish kahals of his most gracious favor. He promised that an ordinance would soon be issued to address their requests, granting improvements in their legal and economic status. For a brief moment, the Tsar's admiration for the patriotism of the Jews appeared sincere, and hope stirred that their lot might be improved. Yet this fragile promise of reform would soon be overwhelmed by the conservative reaction that swept across Europe after the Congress of Vienna in the year 1815, bringing with it a wave of repression that would profoundly affect the Russian Jews. The political turbulence of the period between the years 1789 and 1815 had equally dramatic consequences for the economic and agricultural life of the Jewish population in Western Russia. At that time, the Jewish community was divided roughly into two groups. The majority lived in towns and small urban centers, while a smaller portion resided in villages. The Russian government attempted to concentrate the Jewish population in urban estates and, at the same time, to cultivate a new class of Jewish agriculturists. These efforts largely failed. Rather than creating new opportunities, the policies disrupted the delicate balance between urban and rural occupations, creating uncertainty and hardship for the population. The urban Jew was typically a businessman, an artisan, or a saloon keeper. In many cities, the Jewish mercantile class outnumbered the Christian population engaged in trade, a fact that generated resentment among local merchants. Jewish merchants were particularly active in the export trade. Each year, they traveled in large numbers to international fairs, notably the Leipzig Fair in Germany, to purchase dry goods for resale, while exporting the products of Poland and Russia, including furs, skins, and other commodities. The gradual absorption of Polish territories into the Russian Empire opened an immense new market for these imported goods, reaching deep into the central Russian provinces. The natural inclination of Jewish merchants to expand their business into these regions was met with resistance. Russian merchants, threatened by the competition, petitioned the government to protect the monopoly of native interests, insisting that foreign traders, including Jewish merchants, be restricted. Despite these obstacles, the monopolists could not entirely close the Russian interior to imported goods. The Statute of 1804 granted Jews the right to travel into the interior provinces on special gubernatorial passports, allowing them to continue some commerce. Yet this permission was constrained and conditional. The untrammeled growth of Jewish trade and enterprise was deliberately limited by these artificial barriers, designed to favor local Russian merchants and to restrict the flow of goods from the West. In this way, the ambitions of Jewish traders, both men and women engaged in commerce, were hemmed in by policies that prioritized monopolistic interests over economic development, leaving the communities to navigate a precarious and often hostile economic landscape. In the world of Jewish life under Russian rule, the cities were the stage on which a tragic economic drama was played. The second most common urban occupation after commerce was handicraft work. But handicraft was not a dignified profession. It was considered of lower rank than trade, and it was pursued mainly by the poorest members of the population. Artisan labor, the work of tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, and other craftspeople, commanded very low wages. Purely Jewish trade unions were rare, and a Jewish artisan who dared to leave his native townlet and seek work in a larger city was almost certain to face the organized hostility of Christian guilds. This hostility was not merely economic rivalry. It was a deep social and religious resentment, an organized prejudice that treated the Jewish artisan as a foreigner and a competitor. The memory of such encounters still haunted the Jewish population. Before the Second Partition of Poland, an episode in the Polish capital had escalated into a pogrom, an organized massacre and destruction of Jewish homes and businesses, simply because Jewish artisans had dared to enter the city and seek employment. Alongside the small shop and the cramped workshop stood the public house or saloon, usually connected with an inn or hostelry. In the cities, the sale of liquor depended largely on peasants who came from the villages on festival and market days. On the whole, liquor traffic was not the dominant force in urban life. Its main base was in the villages, where it served as a vital part of rural economy. Yet, despite all the prejudice and the restrictions, every serious observer of the time agreed on one thing: Jewish labor was the cornerstone of civilized economic life in many cities. Without Jewish merchants and artisans, it was almost impossible to buy or sell, or to have any kind of article made. The Jewish businessman, content with small wages and modest profits, could lower the cost of production and the price of merchandise. He lived with extraordinary simplicity. His physical needs were limited, his demands few. And because of this, he could make the economy function even in the poorest towns. The Jewish merchant served as a bridge between the village and the city. Thanks to his mediation, peasants could sell their products on the spot, even those items of such small value that it would not have been worth transporting them to the city. In spite of all his tireless work, however, the Jew was, on average, as poor as the peasant. Yet he was free from one of the peasant's worst vices, drunkenness, a major cause of the peasant's economic misery. This poverty, however, was not a natural condition. It was artificially produced by the overcrowding of cities with petty tradesmen and artisans. This congestion was worsened by the systematic removal of Jews from their long-established rural occupations. As the villages were emptied of Jewish residents, the Jewish population flooded into the towns, intensifying the competition and driving down wages even further. When official records emphasized the liquor traffic in villages as the Jews' sole occupation, they failed to understand the true complexity of Jewish rural life. Yes, liquor was a central part of the economy, but the Jews' rural activities were not limited to it. A Jewish leaseholder who had secured the right to distill liquor from a squire or from the crown often managed several other enterprises simultaneously. He might operate dairies, mills, and fishing ponds. He bought grain from peasants and sold them indispensable goods such as salt, tools, and household utensils imported from the town. In many cases, one man combined the roles of liquor dealer, shopkeeper, and produce merchant. Along the roads from village to city, Jewish inns and public houses stood like beacons. Before the age of railroads, these inns were essential stopping places for travelers. This entire economic structure, built up over centuries, was not simply allowed to decline. It was deliberately dismantled by the Russian government. As early as the reign of Catherine II, governors began driving Jewish villagers into the cities. They acted under the organic law that required Jews to register among the merchant or burgher estates. The ambiguous ukase of 1795, which stated that efforts should be made to transplant Jews into district towns so that they would not wander about to the detriment of society, gave bureaucrats free rein to pursue a policy of displacement. When the law of 1804 ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the villages at the end of 3 years, many landowners did not wait for the deadline. They refused their Jewish tenants the right of residence and trade immediately. The Jews, driven from the countryside, rushed into the cities. Even the long-settled urban residents could not manage to make a living under the pressure of this sudden influx. The government, in its own twisted logic, offered the persecuted Jews 2 new vocations, the establishment of factories and the founding of agricultural colonies. But for the impoverished village Jew, these were empty promises. He had neither the capital nor the expertise to open factories. Even if factories were established, there was no guaranteed market for their products. Several woolen mills were founded by Jews in Lithuania and Volhynia, but they could employ only a few thousand people. The reality was that industrial development could not be created artificially without a stable economic base. It was thus inevitable that all eyes turned toward agricultural colonization. The government's plan, dressed in the language of progress and reform, was in truth a forced attempt to remake Jewish life in a way that served state interests. The Jewish people, already squeezed from the villages and crowded into cities, were now being pushed toward a future they did not choose, under laws and pressures they did not control. The statute issued in the year 1804 had held out a promise that shone like a distant beacon to Jews crushed by poverty and expulsion. It declared that Jews who wished to take up agriculture would be granted free land in several governments of the empire. They would receive loans to purchase tools, livestock, and seed, and for a number of years they would be exempt from taxation. On paper, it sounded like rescue. For the Jews driven from villages and stripped of their livelihoods, it felt like the last rope thrown to a drowning people. The exiled village Jews seized this promise with desperate hope. In the year 1806, several Jewish groups living in the government of Mogilev, a province in White Russia with a large rural Jewish population, appealed directly to the provincial governor. They asked to be transferred to New Russia, the vast southern territories along the Black Sea, where they wished to become corn growers and farmers. These were not idle words. One of the delegates chosen to represent them, a man named Nahum Finkelstein, undertook the long and difficult journey to St. Petersburg. There, in the imperial capital, he laid the case before Prince Victor Kochubey, the Minister of the Interior, one of the most powerful administrators in the empire. Kochubey listened. He went further than words. He dispatched Nahum Finkelstein southward to the government of Kherson, a newly developed province in New Russia, instructing him to inspect the land and select suitable plots for settlement. Acting in coordination with the governor of Kherson, Armand Emmanuel Duplessis, Duke of Richelieu, a French aristocrat in Russian service and one of the chief architects of southern colonization, Kochubey agreed to reserve separate tracts of land in the open steppes of that region. Jewish settlers were to be placed there under the supervision of the new Russian Immigration Bureau, a special agency created to manage colonization and population transfers. The news spread rapidly. Hardly had the 2 Jewish groups from Mogilev completed their preparations for emigration when petitions began to pour in from every corner of the Pale of Jewish settlement. From Lithuania, from White Russia, from Volhynia and Podolaya, Jewish communities submitted application after application. By the end of the year 1806, the number of applicants had risen to 1,500 families, representing approximately 7,000 men, women, and children. The Russian authorities were suddenly confronted with a crisis of their own making. They had encouraged the idea of agricultural settlement, but they were utterly unprepared to carry it out on such a scale. To transport, house, feed, and equip thousands of impoverished families at state expense was far beyond what the